Hello, I'm Mark Martinez, and this is Student-Led World History, and today we're going to talk about the colonization of the Americas. Let's set the stage. European nations, originally Spain and Portugal, but later the Netherlands, France, and England began establishing colonies in the New World. And the previously tiny market for Atlantic goods was growing rapidly. Raw goods would be exported from the New World to the mother country, manufactured there, shipped across Europe, and then shipped back to the colonial holdings. This exchange, as well as many others, are referred to as the Columbian Exchange, which refers to everything exchanged between the Old and the New World, both tangible and intangible. And this exchange was a whole lot better for Europe than the New World. New crops in the New World that were more caloric, like corn and potatoes, could be easily grown instead of European crops. This is the reason that the world population doubled between 1650 and 1850. Another major good from the Americas was silver, so much so that it made Spain the richest nation in the world. Kinda. There was a lot of silver in the New World, and the only other major source of silver was Japan, which was quickly overshadowed. The process of mercury amalgamation was used to purify this silver. The Spanish found large mounds of the silver in Potosí in modern-day Bolivia and in Zacatecas in modern-day Mexico. They used native labor to accomplish this task, since it was super deadly and exporting African slaves was too expensive. The Spanish used Aztec and Incan administrative structures, which allowed them to have a larger degree of control over their colonies. An example of this is the Spanish encomienda system, which was made a whole lot easier by the Incan Midas system. Remember that? The Midas system was a forced labor tax levied at each ailu or community. The Spanish made it personal with the encomienda system and used it to force people into dangerous labor. This system also created a racial caste system within the Spanish Empire. So, like previously said, Spain became the richest nation in the world, hands down. The end. Except no. Spain made silver their baseline currency, but they didn't adjust their taxes to account for the massive influx of silver. This, as many things do, led to massive inflation. Basically, Spain thought they had fat stacks, but they didn't. And what better way to demonstrate these fat stacks than through violent war? Basically, they got involved in a whole lot of war and spent a whole lot of money they didn't have, and ended up pretty broke. Ming China also got hit pretty hard by this inflation, and didn't help themselves by adjusting their tax system to be paid in silver currency. Let me back up. The Ming had a silver-based economy like Spain, so when Spain started to trade directly with the Ming and buy China's luxuries in bulk, the Ming got a lot of silver as well. They also failed to adjust for inflation. This led to their eventual decline, and they would be defeated by the Manchurians in the late 17th century. But that's a story for another day. But the silver trade was the first truly global market, and it made a lot of people rich that didn't stay rich. Also, I'm realizing we're not including Oceania, so please stay tuned for when we talk about them for 10 seconds in about a week and a half. So yeah, silver was one thing extracted by the Spanish, but what about other European nations, I hear you asking? Well, let's talk about France. At least in this area, the French were far more interested in furs than minerals. Although the French expanded quickly and aggressively in Canada, they seemed to be far more focused on conversion of native peoples than making massive profit. An example of this are the Courriers de Bois, who were Amerindian fur traders who traded with the French. But the French did grow cash crops in Saint-Domingue, which would later become Haiti, through the brutal oppression of slaves. The English had similar islands in the Caribbean like Barbados, but their mainland colonies looked a little bit different. In the north, they invaded territory in Canada and present-day New England. Many people in these colonies were Puritans, who were a bit more radical for even the British. They controlled colonies through brutal religious dogma. Down in Virginia, England's colonies were handled by joint stock companies, notably the Virginia Company. They far valued profits over people and brought in massive amounts of slaves from Africa, setting the stage for the U.S. to become the largest slave nation in the world. Speaking of slaves, the transatlantic slave trade was really bad. Thank you. Magnificent. But what was the Atlantic slave trade? Well, it consisted of a ternary economic interdependence between colonies, Western Europe, and Africa, known as the Atlantic Circuit. The passage between Africa and the Americas was called the Middle Passage. Mortality rates were incredibly high, and conditions were horrific. Unlike slavery of the past, the Atlantic slave trade totally dehumanized slaves, and manifested in something called chattel slavery. The majority of slaves were sent to the Caribbean and South America, primarily for plantation work. As you could imagine, conditions of the Americas were very different from those in Africa, and the process which slaves went through in adjusting to the climate changes and all the microbes was called seasoning. And this seasoning is less like salt and pepper, and more like death. The extremely high mortality rate of the Middle Passage, mixed with that of seasoning, meant that slave populations stayed relatively stagnant. But North America had slightly safer conditions, and the majority of the slave population there was born in the Americas, as opposed to being brought from Africa. As you might have noticed, the British and French colonized near each other. This led to the 7 Years' War, which resulted in Britain seizing control of Canada and vast territory in the modern-day United States. And when Britain started taxing the 13 colonies, there were interesting consequences. Yeah, America! The final key player in the colonization of the Americas was the Netherlands. During their war for independence, the Dutch had seized vast colonial holdings in Brazil and Africa from Spain and Portugal. This led to the establishment of the West India Company, which quickly collapsed. However, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, don't ask, came to be far more successful. It brought the Dutch into Indian Ocean trade, which made the Dutch filthy rich. And as you may remember from our previous video, strong trade requires strong navies. Enter the Vloot. The Vloot was a cargo vessel that brought large shipments of goods to Europe. And these guys can really float on the water, if you know what I'm saying. To bring this all back into scope, the colonization of the Americas was an economic venture. Nations postured about helping the less enlightened and spreading Christianity, but largely the reasons for colonization and the continued extraction of goods was economic. This is exemplified by the practice of mercantilism. Mercantilism is basically where European states force their colonies to buy their goods out of a fear of letting wealth slip out of their nations. When comparing the colonization of the Americas with the next wave of colonization, it's important to realize the economic relationship and the differences between the colonizer and the colonized. And while the colonization of the Americas was very much a collision of two worlds, there was a host of negative effects which came along with the increased connectivity. Notably, heavy deforestation occurred in rubber plantations across Brazil and South America, and biodiversity decreased drastically. Diseases flew around like crazy, and the introduction of syphilis to the old world led to a whole lot of stuff that we don't have time to talk about. Because that's everything you need to know about the colonization of the Americas from 1600 to 1800. Tune in next time where we talk about all the thinky people in the Enlightenment. But until then, please subscribe, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.